here are some practical things that you can do when you feel anxious so that it doesn't steal life from you the way that it did for me. Because I know what that feels like, to sit in your room at night and to cry and to feel like you're a failure, to feel like you're just disappointing and letting everyone down.
So what is maybe one or two things that these girls can do, as those feelings of anxiety and depression come on them, because they're very real feelings. The enemy uses them so much to attack their minds.
The first thing that I think of that really kind of helped me walk through changing my thoughts, and it was a process, was to write them down. I would write down every negative thought, because those would be what would come into my head. The negative thoughts about myself, catastrophe thinking about worst case scenarios within school, within leadership roles, friend groups. So writing all of those thoughts out, and I wouldn't even allow myself to worry about punctuation or how neat it was. And that was it was a process. But as fast as those thoughts would come out, I would write them down and get them out just as fast as I could. The page sometimes would be filled with words. Sometimes it would be just a couple of sentences. But then what I would do is I would rip those pages out of that notebook and I would throw them away. But then I needed to take it a step further. I had to replace those negative thoughts, because at first I was not doing that. And those negative thoughts would come back and they would bring friends, like they would bring multiple thoughts. Now it wasn't just anxiety. Now it was dread and despair and depression. So I had to replace those negative thoughts with truth. And so when I say truth, what I would have to do is I'd have to get in my Bible and look up, what does God say about these situations? And I would have to write down those scriptures. And I will be honest with you. I grew up in the church, but I didn't know what all the Bible would say about certain situations. So I would search it up. I would get on Google and I would look up, what does God's word say about sleep? What does God's word say about who I am, how I was created? Is there a plan, for my life? And I would write down those scriptures. And sometimes I would have to write them down multiple times, just day after day. And then I would say it out loud. I would have myself in a place where I could say it out loud, because I had to hear it, not just write it, but I had to hear myself say it. And there would be times where I would say them and I would just be straight up honest with God and say, hey, I don't believe this about myself today. Help me to believe it. I know your word is true. Help me to believe it. And so that was one of the things that I had to do. Write it down, take it captive, release it, and replace it with truth. So I would say that was a big one for me. Another one that I have learned how to practice more and more is gratitude, just the power of gratitude. As I've studied different ways to deal with anxiety, scientists have done so many studies on gratitude, and they have seen that it is a built-in anxiety blocker. So when you can shift your perspective on good things around you, not that we're avoiding the bad, but that we are looking for the good. I mean, getting very specific. When I get up in the morning, what are 3 things I'm thankful for today? It might be a favorite pair of shoes, a favorite hoodie. Maybe it is a favorite item that you're going to have for lunch that day. And then when you get done, before you go to bed at night, what were 3 good things, new things that you can do? And that's another thing you can journal as well. But as you challenge yourself to practice gratitude, it shifts everything for you, how you feel, how you think, how you look at the world. So those 2 things have been very helpful. And I would say to social media, be very careful. If we are on social media 4 or 5 or more hours a day, our brains tend to be more anxious because we're constantly getting that blue light. It's constantly feeding our brain. And it's like our brain kind of gets overwhelmed with information, but we're also getting overwhelmed with comparison, looking at these filtered highlight reels, highlight pictures, and comparing our behind the scenes. So if you find that you are doing that, comparing yourself, you're on social media several hours a day, pull back, take 1 hour off, unfollow accounts that make you feel very negative about yourself. I would definitely do those things. If you find that you are constantly wanting to keep your snap streaks alive, maybe as a friend group, say, hey, let's go 24 hours and break our streaks together and see what happens. See what a 24-hour detox can do for your brain. Even for us as adults, we need to do that. It's not just for you guys. We need to do that as well. And if your phones are in your room when you go to bed at night, consider charging them somewhere else. Because what do? We're like, oh, I got to check just one more thing. I do it. I'm guilty. And I check the one more thing and then I start to scroll. And now it is midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we're exhausted the next day. So if you can get your phone out of the room, so you're not checking it so that it's not, keeping you from getting the rest you need. That is another thing that I truly think can help you. And if you're not on social media, continue to wait. I promise you it's worth it to just wait, to find different ways to communicate and stay connected with your friend group. But those are the first ones that come to mind when I think of some quick things that you guys can do at your age to begin to combat those anxious thoughts. And a lot of times I think that's where anxiety comes for teens, is through our thoughts, what you're thinking, what your belief is about yourself. Wouldn't you say that too, that this is really a process for them to begin to learn how to respond and what's going to work best for them?
Absolutely, it is. Romans 12:2 says, and do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's what she's talking about when she says replacing those thoughts with God's word. We're basically lining up our words to be in agreement with what God says about us. And it says, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. And that word perfect means mature. So whenever you start to renew your mind, it gets better. And then the more that you do it, the more that you do it, the more that you do it, it becomes acceptable or even better, where it's like, oh, this is good. Like, I'm accepting the truth of who God says I am. And then it matures. And then when those negative thoughts and thoughts of anxiety start to come in, you can catch it immediately, because it's like, whoa, that's foreign to me now. And so I remember being in that place of like the dark depression and anxiety. And anytime those thoughts came, it was normal. It was normal to me. But then I began to speak God's word over my life and say, I'm not going to accept this anymore. And every time those thoughts came in, I'm like, no, I'm going to cast it down, because 2 Corinthians tells me to cast down anything that comes against the knowledge of God and what God thinks about me. So I'm not going to accept it. And then as I began to speak God's word in place of of those thoughts, it was a little foreign at first. It was like, okay, I don't really feel this way. And then the more I began to do it, now those thoughts didn't come around as much anymore. And so now I could catch it as soon as they came up. It was like, no, I don't believe that about myself anymore. And so, yes, it's a process.
We actively take our thoughts captive. We can do that action. I thought that if a thought came in, that I had to accept it, not realizing that we are bombarded with thousands upon thousands of thoughts a day. And we can be active in what gets to stay and what gets to go. And so that, I think, goes back to what you're talking about, and transforming our mind and renewing our mind. And that comes for us by spending time in God's word, by having that daily time with him, having that time of community, small group, church time, together, building that camaraderie together in God's word. And the more we hide that in our heart, or just spending that time with him, the more that we are able to see when that anxiety comes with lies, we can see it quicker, and then we can take it captive and replace it with what we know is truth from God.
Yeah, absolutely. And that verse that you're talking about is 2 Corinthians 10:5. It says, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, meaning anything that comes against what God says, it doesn't line up with what God says, but it goes against it. It says, bring every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So we want to make sure that our thoughts are lining up with God's word, because I'll tell you what, John 8:32 says it's the truth that we know that makes us free, and we can actually be free in our thought life.
That's powerful. That's gets me fired up. And I was looking at this version on my phone when you said the reference, we destroy those arguments. So to know that the enemy, his arguments, it doesn't get to stay there. We can destroy it, that God is giving us that power, that ability to do that. That just gets me a little excited inside, just to think, okay, I don't have to accept what the enemy is trying to plant in my spirit.
So good.
And I just want you to know that this battle or the struggle that you might be facing with anxiety, you're not alone in that. Your struggle is real. Jesus told us that we would have troubles, but take heart, because he has overcome, and with him on your side, so we can do what his word tells us we can do. You don't have to wait till you're an adult. You can do these things right now. You can do them. Lean on him, lean on his strength, lean on his goodness and his word, and just allow him to lead you one step at a time. Stick with the process. Know that it's not going to be overnight, and just know that what the enemy meant for evil, God is going to use for good in your life.